Welcome to B2B Commerce Corner. Commerce Corner is a sub-series of the E-Commerce Edge podcast discussing all things B2B commerce through the lens of agencies, consultants, merchants, and more. Enjoy. Another episode of the E-Commerce Edge podcast. I have another incredible guest to introduce you today, but before I do that, I would love to encourage you to go to whichever podcast platform is your favorite or YouTube, like, comment, and share, because we rely on you to get the word out about our amazing content. We have a back catalog of over 450 episodes of the podcast, so go ahead and check that out and give us feedback however you wish, because we always love to take your feedback into account when we're thinking of next guests to feature on the podcast. But without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Alexis DELPLANQUE from DJUST to the podcast. Welcome, Alexis.
Thank you, Jason. Very nice to be here.
So cool to have you along for the ride today. You're in a what looks like a soundproof booth, so we should have no interruptions, no problems with barking dogs or sirens on the outside, right?
Exactly. My phone is on flight mode.
Love it.
I told everybody
I respect the preparation. Very nice. And you're calling in from France, right? Where are you based?
Paris.
Okay.
So we have nice offices in the center of Paris, but we're also present internationally. So I'm happy to talk about that as well.
Love it. Fantastic. Now, before we speak about what DJUST is and does, and all transparency, I've never worked with you or your platform before. B2B commerce focused platform has lots of features and functions that I think are pretty necessary and pretty table stakes for a lot of B2B brands today. But before we get into that, what drew you into this wonderful world of e-commerce to begin with? Like, how did you get to be here?
My first job after leaving university was actually at a company called Miracle, which
most people in our industry will be familiar with the Miracle Marketplace platform, that's for sure.
Very good. And yeah, actually, I started there when the company was starting. There were 30 people in the company. I was hired by Adrien, one of the two co-founders, who then developed the US market very successfully, by the way. And so I stayed there for a couple of years and then moved on to Snowflake, which is a very famous tech software company from the US. And it was also starting at the time in Europe. So I was the first sales rep in France, actually, at Snowflake. So I stayed there for 4 years. And then I was continuing to see my ex-partner in crime, who is actually one of the founding members of Miracle and who was at the time launching DJUST because of an experience he had at Miracle when it was very complicated for him to launch B2B marketplaces on top of e-commerce platforms that weren't really fit for B2B. So that's where he got the idea of launching a B2B specific e-commerce platform. And I thought the idea was great. And I came and joined him for all the sales activity at the company.
Wow. So you took over, it sounds like he's maybe the more technical sort of guy leading up the tech side of the business, and you're leading up more biz dev, sales, etc. side of the business. Would that be fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a third co-founder, which is more focused on the product. So that's the three of us. Yeah.
Wow. The three legs of the stool that you absolutely have to have if you're going to go to market with a tech product, right? You got to have the product, you got to have the technical, you got to have the design, you got to have the business acumen to make use of the technology, but then you have to have somebody out there being the evangelist for the tech. Sounds like you're the evangelist.
Might sound like it, yeah.
Okay. Absolutely love it. And what, I guess before we get specifically into what DJUST does that makes it stand out and unique in the space, what made the team think, geez, okay, because if we look out across the landscape of B2B e-commerce platforms, either specifically targeted at B2B or at least having B2B capabilities within the platform, what was it when you looked out across the landscape that made you think there's nothing out there today that does what we think it should do? We think there's a gap in the market for a new technology, for a new platform out there. Because the reality is there's probably something like 30 B2B focused e-commerce platforms out there, or B2B only platforms out there. So it's a pretty competitive landscape. And you clearly have the stomach for startups because you worked effectively for 2 startups before you got involved with your own startup. So you clearly have a thick skin for the startup landscape and the challenges that brings. But what made you guys think we can build a better mousetrap?
Yeah, you're right. It's a very crowded space. It was a crowded space. I think it's even crowded now. It is, it's challenging, to be honest, to be fighting against all those great competitors. But also the idea came up at a time when we were really with customers experiencing all the kind of troubles they were going through while trying to launch a B2B platform. And at the time, so the company is 4 years old now, and at the time, 2020, the way we realized it was like we were at Miracle selling that great marketplace engine, connecting it to those e-commerce platforms and being very successfully delivering those platforms to the B2C world. And whenever we did that for the B2B, we had to connect with all the very known e-commerce platforms. I'm not going to name them, but you know them, which were mostly focused at providing B2C features. And so in those platforms, we, for those projects, had to rebuild entirely the B2B features on top of those B2C platforms. Sometimes we had to connect with B2B specific platforms, but those B2B specific platforms are actually very old-fashioned platforms in their technologies they're using. The product is very old-fashioned, very rigid. Usually those platforms that are entirely focused at B2B have been developed in the 90s, some in Germany in the 90s, where the technology assets that you had at the time were not the kind of microservices, API-based, headless capabilities that you have today. So in fact, we were seeing those two markets, the B2C commerce platforms and the B2B commerce platforms, not benefiting all the newest technologies at the same pace. So you had the emergence of Shopify, of BigCommerce, of all those great tools that are benefiting from all the modern technologies, but in B2B, not really. In B2B, if you are launching a B2B commerce platform in 2020, you are still like either going to have to choose between a B2C platform that you have to retro-engineer to have all the B2B features, or a B2B specific platform where you have the rigidity of an old-fashioned technology. So the idea of Just was really gathering those two worlds, the best of those two worlds, and providing the most advanced B2B features with all the technology capabilities to basically answer the customer needs, being have agility, have flexibility in a moving environment, in an environment that changes over time, where you are a B2B company, you tend to acquire a new company and then have to plug that new ERP to your ecosystem. That's complicated with a monolith. You have to launch a new product line, which requires flexibility in the way you manage catalogs. You have to occur a new market. It's a new use case. It can be another territory, another segment of customers. It can be because you're aiming at developing an offer with sustainable products and you don't have that in your kind of base. You know, all those use cases that require agility require an agile platform. And in B2B, you need an agile platform that does B2B. And that's what Just is about.
Nice. I like the pitch. I think the reality is that many of us, even those of us that have been in the e-commerce world for many decades in some instances, I think we all realized, but especially B2B sellers, manufacturers, wholesalers, and distributors, when COVID hit, I think most B2C and D2C brands were more well-equipped to deal with a digital world than most of the B2B world was. And the reality is that retail, even before COVID, it would have been unthinkable to have a retail brand that didn't offer e-commerce. It was just unthinkable. Now, those brands weren't necessarily ready for 90 to 95% of their revenue to come through their digital channels, but they were far more prepared than the B2B world was. And what I experienced is that the B2B world got religion real fast about digital, especially when COVID really started to take hold. Field sales reps couldn't go out. They couldn't be with customers. They couldn't visit customers. They couldn't do their regular call cycles. They couldn't knock on new doors. So not only did they have to think about, oh my God, how are we going to service our existing cohort of customers digitally, but how are we going to start acquiring customers digitally? And even for some of those brands that maybe did have a gated e-commerce experience, maybe it was a legacy experience, maybe only 5% of their customers maybe used that legacy e-commerce experience. It wasn't exposed to Google, so nobody even knew they existed if they were searching for a new supplier digitally or whatever the case may be. These businesses had to evolve super, super rapidly. And I'm guessing that is what gave you a little bit of the confidence that, hey, here's a market, here's an opportunity because B2B brands are being forced to evolve. And it's not just evolve, but we like to say in tech, evolution is better than revolution, because revolution is hard to swallow as a business from a transformation perspective, from a change management perspective. But these brands literally had to, it was a revolution for a lot of these brands. A lot of B2B brands, they're second, third generation, family-owned businesses. They've done things the same way for many years, multiple generations. And all of a sudden, with COVID, they started to have to think about digital in ways that they maybe never considered before. And did that add fuel to your fire at the time in terms of saying, hey, we think we've got an almost ready-made market here because of the impacts of COVID on the B2B world, unlike we've ever seen before?
Yeah, it's very interesting, and it's probably the first thought we had when we launched Just, being exactly at that time COVID, and that accelerated. And those are basically the companies we were looking at as prospects. First of all those family-owned businesses that are still taking orders on pieces of paper, sending reps across the country in cars, paying for gas. It's expensive. And it's actually, when you interview all those people and actually all the managers, they're like, that's the cost of just taking orders that would anyway be here. And that's also the cost of not sending reps to new customers to acquire them and sign new contracts with them. So like, it's probably the first thought we had, providing those companies with the ability to basically digitize. And because they were very late to that party, providing them with that capability. But when you were asking about how we differentiate and how we position ourselves as opposed to other e-commerce platforms, it's probably a speech that those companies have heard from other companies. You have to digitize. It's time now. It's 2020. It's time to digitize. So I think the digitization pitch has worked for some of those companies, but at a certain moment in time, you're like facing all your competitors and everybody's saying the same thing. And you have to think a bit different. So the way we looked at it was basically lots of B2B businesses were already digitized. But the way they had digitized was through adopting e-commerce platforms, either from the market or either developing their own platforms, because you didn't have such a great offer at the time. And lots of those companies have actually digitized before B2C with technologies that they developed themselves. And in fact, when you are looking at lots of those B2B companies doing e-commerce today, lots of those have only thought about B2B e-commerce being one of the channels, but not really including them in all the channels. B2B, by nature, is omni-channel, because even if like during COVID, it was complicated for reps to go here and there and sign with customers and meet with customers, all B2B companies need reps, and it's not going to change. It's not going to change tomorrow. They're still going to need reps to interact with customers, because basically it's what customers want. Customers want to interact with a rep, to negotiate good deals.
They've been trained by the seller to deal with a rep.
Exactly. But so B2B is omni-channel. And lots of what we've seen in terms of customers using e-commerce platforms, either their own or from the market, doing B2B e-commerce, it was mostly the transposition of, say, 5-10% of the overall revenue online. But there's no growth out of that. It's just a transposition of one share of the revenue to online revenue. There's no growth. And what we really wanted was to empower companies with B2B commerce capabilities, not B2B e-commerce capabilities, but with B2B commerce capabilities, like digital B2B commerce. So we thought of including those channels into the platform. Sales reps are able to use the platform. Whatever they're placing in terms of orders on behalf of their customers, you can find them on the platform. We've opened to all the other channels. Lots of those B2B companies interact with their customers through external systems. Like, their customers are actually buyers. And when you're dealing with a large company, a buyer would rarely go to an e-commerce platform from every of their suppliers. So they go to an e-procurement platform.
EDI, so e-procurement, something like that.
Exactly. And we connect with all those channels, and we basically provide that B2B commerce core engine to gather all the interactions with the customer. So it's not we're providing only an e-commerce platform and that should compare with all the other e-commerce platforms. We're really here to help those companies grow in a digital world. Yeah, I think this is one of the biggest points that we came to realize while discussing and while dealing with those companies. And there's also another aspect you mentioned in your last comment, which was digital customer acquisition. You mentioned that because of what happened with COVID and the reps not being able to move to the customers and acquire them in a traditional way. In fact, I think it's one of the points that's interesting in B2B, but it's also a differentiation point with B2C. Lots of those e-commerce platforms that we've been mentioning are B2C platforms, but also they're now providing more and more B2B features, but they still think of B2B as all the customers, all the millennials that are buyers in B2B tend to become the equivalent of B2C consumers and they want the same experience and so on and so forth. I think it's true for a share of the business. But again, as I said, lots of those customers are still using the old-fashioned tools and are still going to use the old-fashioned tools. And you're not going to convince everybody all at once to get onboarded themselves on a website. And so I think those are interesting topics and features to provide, but also let's not forget that those are two different worlds, and the habits that you have in B2B will not be overcome by all the habits you have in B2C.
And I think also, to your point, probably from your miracle days and also from your co-founders' miracle days, but it's very true that in the B2B world, very rarely is a manufacturer only a manufacturer, for example, or it's very rare that a distributor is only a distributor or a reseller, right? Or a wholesaler. It's very often, at least what I see, and I don't know if it's the same in Europe, but definitely in North America, it's very common that a manufacturer might only manufacture 20% of their catalog, say, for example, but they want to sell an entire solution to the market. And so they might be a manufacturer and a distributor. So like 80%, 60, 70, 80% of their products, they're a distributor for, and then 20, 30% of their catalog, they actually make themselves. If I make pumps, for example, there's all sorts of ancillary items that I don't want to, the B2B world has basically moved on from the concept of selling SKUs to selling bundles, packages, solutions to the market, right? To the point where if you're an industrial product supplier, or let's say you're making a certain product, oftentimes these B2B sellers, they've got full engineering capability in-house. They have full project management capability in-house. They have the ability to spec entire installations of products and solutions. And so there has, and I've witnessed this even over the last 5-6 years, that the B2B world has evolved pretty rapidly. It was only partly affected by COVID or driven by COVID, but the market was becoming more solution orientated even before COVID. And as a result of that, B2B sellers have two roads they can, or three major roads by which they can expand their business, right? They can either manufacture more products if they're a manufacturer, they can take on more products directly as a distributor, or they can, instead of taking on the products fully themselves and actually warehousing all of those products in the entire catalog of 1 million items themselves and shipping it direct, they can say, we're gonna keep in stock like 20 or 30% of our catalog, the top moving items. The rest we're gonna sell direct and we're gonna take payment for, but we're gonna send those orders off to the suppliers as a drop ship order that they will fulfill directly to the customer. Or there's this new sort of third option nowadays, which is let's just become a marketplace. We'll become a supplier on our own marketplace for our own products if we're a manufacturer. And instead of drop shipping the rest of our catalog for the slower moving items, let's just let the vendors, the other distributors, the other manufacturers list those products on our website, and let's monetize our traffic in that way. And let's just clip the ticket in a very low lift kind of way as those transactions traverse our marketplace, right? Because it means we're not responsible then for loading the product into our ERP. We're not responsible for loading up all the imagery, all the product attributes, the descriptions, all the CPQ capabilities required around those products. We don't have to think about that. That's ultimately the seller's responsibility, and we give them access to our marketplace where they can list those products on there, and then we just have a trade agreement with them where we effectively take a commission for everything that flows through our sales channels. So it feels, and that doesn't even speak about the EDI sales opportunities, the punch-out / e-procurement sales opportunities, or third-party marketplace sales opportunities. But just for brands themselves, there are multiple ways to skin the same cat of go-to-market. And there are multiple ways to choose to expand your catalog. Some are higher lift and higher margin. Some are lower lift, lower margin. But the B2B world seems to be getting religion around the concept of omni-channel really quickly, because it's rare that a single supplier can supply and make every single thing that they sell. It's really difficult to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're touching on how heterogeneous and how varied this market is. We've learned over the past 4 years how customers are different from one another, industries. I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but to come back on the multi-supplier type of platforms, I think it's something that Miracle has been very good at, spreading the word. When we were starting to address B2B at Miracle, I don't think there were lots of use cases in which you had a manufacturer thinking about launching a multi-seller marketplace. This is something that they were very good at launching and talking about marketing. Yeah, and it just makes sense. It just makes sense when you're that manufacturer and trying to get a hold of that customer data, for example, and that have forever been the asset of your distributors, and now you're able to use it. It just makes sense. And in terms of, lots of those B2B companies are really different from one another. And as I said at the beginning, we were really targeting those very traditional businesses. So it's building supplies, distributors, it's food supplies distributors, office supplies. Yeah, lots of those companies are selling those products in a very traditional way. So that was the first aim, and that was the only conception we had of a B2B customer at the time. And then we started discussing with retailers, and we were like, okay, what's the use case for a retailer? And there were actually a couple of use cases. It was 2 years ago. Inflation struck badly, and those retailers were all thinking about ways to diversify their sources of revenue. And so retailers starting doing B2B. Actually, this is something that we were better at developing in Europe than in the US. We've been discussing with lots of those big retailers in the US, and while they're interested about it, they're still, I think, a bit afraid of launching that new line of business at the moment because of supply chain constraints or those kind of things. But we've successfully launched those kind of platforms in Europe. But also there was something that we were not conscious about at all in retail. Lots of those retailers we have here in Europe are working with the franchise business model. And so in the franchise business model, what we didn't know is that it's actually a B2B transaction that happens between the franchisor and the franchisees. And now we are building platforms for basically stores to procure from a headquarter with specific pricing, specific catalogs, specific validation workflows, all the kind of features that you would expect in a B2B platform. And today, Just is processing the entirety of the turnover of those retailers because it's all they do. They sell. The customer of such a retailer is the store. It's not the consumer, it's the store. So
it's almost like a buying group or a co-op. It's exactly the same. It's exactly the same model.
Absolutely. And you have a lot of those in the hardware sector in the US, where it's decentralized organizations with every distributor member of the group is a specific company, is an independent company. So it's quite interesting to see those platforms emerge. But again, it is a B2B platform. And I think that's why you have all those communications on the market saying B2B is 5 times bigger than B2C and so on and so forth. But it's just because you have so many more points of contact between companies in B2B than you have in B2C. You have, for those groups, buying groups, you have the transaction that happens between let's say the franchisor and the franchisee, and then you have the transaction that happens between the actual member and its customers, and then you can have between the customer and the sole trader or whatever. But yeah, it's quite interesting to see how vast the territory is for anyone selling a B2B software technology.
And to your point, I think the acceleration of the aging out of legacy B2B buyers, that is accelerated. And Forrester just a couple of months ago came out with some research that in the US, over 71% of B2B buyers now are millennials or Gen Z. So the reality is that as the buying demographic has changed, that has forced the seller demographic to change in the way that they interact with the buyer. And the reality is a millennial or a Gen Z buyer, they're not necessarily waiting for Bob or Jane, the sales rep, to come down and knock on their door. They're not waiting to hear from them with a spec sheet over email or fax. They're not, whilst they still appreciate the relationship aspects where it's needed, they want to be the ones who make that choice. They want to choose when and how they interact with their assigned rep, not be forced to because they have no other option. And the reality is, especially in wholesale distribution, I don't know if you're seeing this in Europe, but in wholesale distribution, the margins are so thin that most wholesale distributors will only buy off of a supplier now if they will supply to them via e-procurement. Because on the wholesale distribution side, they're running all their procurement through a Coupa, a Jagger, some sort of e-procurement module, or it's part of an e-procurement module in their ERP system or something like that. And they're automating huge portions of their buying process to claw back some of the margin that they were spending on admin functions and buying functions within the business. And so if you're not able to service them, then they will probably either not buy from you, or they will simply ask for a larger discount from you to offset the manual work they have to do to buy through you. And either way, that's a bad thing for the supplier, either way.
It's very interesting because all the things you just mentioned are discussions that we have had like over the past 4 years. It's the first RFP we participated to was with a big building supplies organization in France. We're from France, so it was an obvious RFP to participate in for us. Exactly the type of companies we mentioned, building supplies, buying group. And they were actually risking of not participating themselves into the customer's RFP if they didn't provide the digital buying capacity. So they're answering RFPs of large organizations such as big construction companies or even city halls that are managing building sites or whatever. And this distributor or distributor network, being a supplier among other potential suppliers, were risking of not participating anymore to those work sites. So it was urgent and a matter of survival for them to digitize. So when they're not forced like that, sometimes they don't realize that their customers are expecting, as you said, it's exactly like you say, it's buyers, customers tend to want the whole shebang of possibilities to place orders. It's not necessarily like the moment you are offering digital capability to order, I'm going to use it 100% of the time, or all the customer base is going to use it. It's just, it needs to be there because it needs to convince or fit with a part of your customer base. And I've been discussing with an equivalent company in the UK where the way they are dealing with lots of their customer accounts, like large accounts, is Excel sheets to place an order. And I was like,
it hurts my soul to hear that.
Yeah, and I was asking, like, aren't your customers asking for a different way of buying stuff? And they were like, no, they like it with Excel files. Why we're not digitizing? Because the customers like it to order through an Excel file. Maybe there's a segment of your customers who like it, but there's an entire range of customers, I'm sure, who want to access the data, just accessing the post-order status. Where's my order at?
Track
when am I going to be delivered?
Yeah. Quote requests, RMAs, historic invoices, checking credit statuses. There's so many digital services. Okay, maybe the transaction continues to be emailed to you in a CSV or something like that you enter into your ERP.
But to track it.
But what about the rest of the digital services? Yeah. What about checking inventory? What about checking availability? What about checking MOQs? What about checking buying increments? What about all those things? Like, the customer doesn't want to wait for their sales rep to email them all this information. Or what if they need a spec sheet? What if they need an exploded drawing? What if they need some collateral around a product because it's an engineered product and they need to know the weight loading capability of this steel beam? The reality is they want to be able to self-service that stuff, even if they continue to transact in the way that they always have. And this is the thing I think that a lot of B2B sellers overlook, is the digital services layer, as I like to call it. And the reality is that we now can transact through other digital hybrid channels like WhatsApp, like Slack, like via email. If an order comes in like that, we can actually ingest that automatically map that into our e-commerce system and get that into our e-commerce system in a digital way, in an automated way, whilst still supporting the way that they actually want to transact with us. So I feel like a lot of B2B sellers, they have put digital into the too hard basket for so long that they're closed off to even hearing about the evolution of the industry over the last 4 to 5 years, especially since COVID. And I think they're doing themselves a disservice, and they're really putting themselves at risk out of, as you just pointed out, especially in specific scenarios where maybe there's an RFP or there's a pitch to become a MSP or a preferred service provider or a preferred supplier in a specific buying opportunity or a buying group. When you automatically qualify yourself, or even with government contracts, for example, most government contracts today are electronic tenders, it's electronic supply, and it's electronic buy. Even if the purchase is done via EDI, digital services, that they expect as part of that tender that you will supply to them. And it could be things like serial number tracking, warranty provision. It could be all these digital services that are required to even become a potential supplier into a specific organization. And if you're not ready for that, getting that set up like in a really short period of time, like it's going to take you 6 to 12 months to get this all up and running. And if the tender closes in 30 days and you don't offer that stuff, you might as well just count yourself out of that. So I think a lot of B2B sellers, they're selling themselves short of what the opportunity cost is if they don't do digital in some meaningful way.
Yeah. And there's something that you mentioned that was quite interesting is, like, you have, as a B2B buyer, you have a lot more to do with your supplier than just transacting. And that's exactly the reason why we decided to create a flexible platform, a headless platform, to be able to be included in a wider offer of service, digital service, being named usually a customer portal or whatever. But people actually need more than just a transaction. They need a lot of services. They need a lot of interactions with their supplier. And as a supplier, you get all those touch points as data points that you can then reuse for upsell or cross-sell opportunities. But it's a pity not to benefit from that. Having to deal with your customer in a traditional way, so many data are lost in your interactions or your potential interactions with your customer. It's really a pity not to be able to use that.
And in the B2C and D2C world, they've been using things like site search data, for example, for new product development forever to inform the new product development process. They understand what abandoned carts look like. They understand what deletions from cart look like. They understand what lost sales opportunities look based on which products are out of stock and unavailable that usually get bundled with other products. So it's not just, okay, I've lost the sale on the items that are out of stock, but I've also lost the complementary items that I'd normally sell alongside of that. And so I see that direct impact with a higher percentage of out-of-stock items, then my conversion rate drops in line with more out-of-stock items, not just on those items, but overall. And to your point, I think there's an opportunity to personalize in the B2B world that's totally miles above, over and above what we can personalize in the B2C and D2C world, because most of our customers in the B2C world, they're totally unknown to us. They might as well be, unless they bought more than one time, they're completely unknown to us. They are effectively a guest visitor every single, at least for the first purchase anyway. And so the best we can hope for in the B2C world in terms of personalization is wisdom of the crowd personalization, right? Okay, what people like you have done before. When they take a specific behavior on our website, we can predict which things they want to be shown, which products they've looked at, which products would they like to look at, which products that they bought, which products are they likely to like to buy based on the attributes of those products, etc. And maybe based on some demo if you capture that as part of the account creation process. But in the B2B world, it's radically different, because even to become a customer in the B2B world, you've got to give so much information about your business, who you are as the buyer, who you are as the seller. You've got to create a trade account. You've got to go through an application process. You've got to set up a custom catalog for that buyer. You've got to set up usually custom pricing for that buyer. You have to know so much more about your customer even to begin to transact with them, that then the opportunities to personalize beyond that are pretty extreme in comparison to the B2C world. And it's not just personalized in the self-service e-commerce experience, but it's in all aspects of dealing with them. How do they want to actually transact with you? Do they want to send you orders via a PDF attached to a WhatsApp message? Do they want to send you a screenshot, which is crazy, but it still happens, a screenshot of a CSV that's on the screen, and then they'll send that screenshot through to you and say, hey, can you place this order for me? Especially with AI, with machine vision, machine learning, we now have the ability today to automate those processes, which even just a few short years ago were completely impossible to do.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And there's the misconception in B2B that all what customers are expecting is price and commodity of buying. And so personalization it's B2C, it's not B2B. Merchandising, it's B2C, it's not B2B. And it makes me think of one of our customers who's exactly that, what I mentioned in grocery. They're like a big supermarket chain and doing business as a franchise model. And so their customers are their stores. And the B2B transaction there, the initial B2B transaction is actually, I'm going to push all the products that you need to fill your shelves with. And it can almost be an Excel file where you can adjust the quantities based on what you think you will have or will not have in stock. But that's all, price, commodity. And then we're starting discussing with that customer, and he's saying that store in that region has its own specificities. The customers going there, the consumers going there, expect more of this product than this product. You're going to get more margin out of this product based on what we analyze on all the stores that are in your region, etc. So then you start with a new platform, a digital capability, getting all those data that makes you change the way you're addressing that to, I'm going to personalize in depth whatever my assortment is going to be for that store and whatever my assortment is going to be for that other store. And out of that, the store A is going to be way more profitable because they're going to pick the right products that correspond exactly to what the consumers going there are going to expect. That store B is going to have a totally different assortment based on all types of data. But yeah, that's an example of how data is essential to personalizing to the end the B2B experience. And actually, as a matter of fact, B2B is all about personalization by in its own DNA. You personalize the pricing, you personalize the catalog that the customers are accessing, you personalize the workflows, the buyers are going to buy through. It's all about personalization, in fact.
And another point you bring up that I think is so valid is that even if my transaction with my buyer is a B2B transaction, that doesn't necessarily mean that their transaction with their customer is a B2B transaction. Sometimes it's B2B2C, right? And in that scenario, if we can't supply them product data in a meaningful way that then could be presented, for example, either at point of sale or on their own website, their own retail website, if we're not supplying them the complete product data over and above just the SKU and the price, or maybe the SKU, the name and the price, if we're not supplying them more data than that, then they won't be able to effectively sell once they receive the products from us. And so it's all the way down the chain. It's this chain of custody of data that becomes super, super important, and the sharing of data between entities that becomes super important based on permissions and what they should see and what they shouldn't see. This is a very complex consideration. And then when we take into account really complex workflows in some B2B industries like automotive, say, for example, where you, or industrial supplies, where you have a fitment component. Okay, this item fits this device or whatever it might be, or this is a cross-reference compatible substitute product for this OEM part number, for example. Or what about heavily regulated industries like electrical, for example, where a certain product has to be able to carry a certain current, or where we have highly regulated industries where the product attributes and the product data are essential as part of the buying process because they're determined for a specific application. And if you get that wrong or you don't supply that data, then oftentimes the wrong product will be bought for the wrong application, and then there's a liability question at play as a result of that, especially if it causes, say, a fire because it was used in the wrong application. I think in the B2B world, and at worst, maybe I'm going to get a few returns. But in the B2B world, product data and how we present that to the customer becomes an essential part of the buying process itself and the specification process. And I think a lot of B2B sellers don't think about when they're getting ready to adopt these digital channels. And oftentimes when I go in and I'm consulting, they got data spread everywhere. They got it on local drives. They've got it on sales reps' desktops. They've got it in printed catalogs. They've got data spread in every format you can imagine across the entire business. And one of the first things I see when I go in is trying to help them get prepped for digital channels requires a deep understanding of where all this data needs to come from, be aggregated into, and how it needs to be structured for digital sales channels. Do you run into that a lot too, where a lot of these B2B businesses, they don't really have good data governance processes in their business before they are trying to adopt digital channels, and they go, oh my God, we really have to get our shit together for these digital channels?
Yeah, we run into that. It's a transformational project for lots of those companies, lots of those manufacturers. Actually, distributors might be a bit more ready, but manufacturers, one of the companies we deal with, we had to connect with an ERP that dates back to 1997. So you can imagine the quality of the data there. Lots of those companies have looked at digitization and like providing an e-commerce platforms for their customers to buy from as something they have to do, but not really invest in how it transforms the company and the way they deal with their customers. So sometimes it's a challenge. It's a change management that you have to go through to make sure the data is correctly qualified for a digital channel, that it's not there's a data project, I guess, before there is an e-commerce project, and it's just e-commerce for the sake of e-commerce. You have to be prepared for all the digital channels. Sometimes those companies tend to think they just have to plug a front end onto their ERP, which is not the right answer. You need a complete middleware that will be the intermediary step between all the kind of silos of data, all the different systems, all the old-fashioned and new systems that they have internally, because lots of the time those manufacturers have quite a lot of heterogeneous systems. You need like something in between the interface that your customer is going to interact with and your backend, sometimes old-fashioned systems. And in terms of, there is like the data quality and data governance, but there is also a requirement of how many data can you add on top of the data that you have internally. And that's why also you need an intermediary step. For example, we're working with the leader in yeast manufacturing. And as you said, lots of the data they have is essential to the customer whenever they're buying the product, because it concerns health. Yeast is a part of the production process of probiotics, for example. So they're selling to the health industry. They're also selling, of course, the baking industry or to the beer industry. So in the end, it's something that people are going to consume. It's going to have or matter on the health of these people. So they have to be very strict on the data they're adding on top of all the kind of product data they have in their system. So it requires a lot of flexibility on how you can interact with your own data and how you present the data to your customers.
And if we think about the different modules, so to speak, that you guys provide as part of the Just platform, you've got the e-commerce module, you've got a replenishment module, and you've got a marketplace module, right? A multi-vendor marketplace module. Talk to me a little bit more. First of all, do you offer, you said it's a headless platform, but do you offer your own front end? It's maybe a headless architecture, but do you offer your own headless front end that's hosted by you guys to go along with your e-commerce backend? That's the first question. Then two, talk to me a little bit more about the replenishment module. Is that kind of a bit more like an order management module?
Yeah, so the base of what we do is that B2B engine, where we have developed lots of the backend features that correspond to what you would expect in terms of capability of a B2B e-commerce platform. So in that engine, you would manage all the price policies. Either you would manage them from the back office we provide, or you would just connect with
integrate them in from your ERP,
integrate with the ERP, CRM, whatever. So we provide that core engine, which is then connected through APIs to headless front ends, plural, because we can have multiple front ends on top of one single backend. And the last customer I shared the story of is actually having multiple front ends for different regions, different use cases. In Mexico, they're not dealing with the same type of customers as they are to South Korea. And the kind of products those markets are interacting with are not the same. The features they are using are not the same. So it's one of the advantages of providing different templates for different user interfaces, user experiences, basically. And yes, we provide templates for those front-end projects to be accelerated. So they are already off the shelf things that you can use to very quickly launch and operate your B2B commerce platform. So that's the first thing. And that's on the B2B commerce platform we provide. Honestly, like lots of companies tend to see us as a Shopify for B2B. I know it's something we probably will mention until we get sued by Shopify. But in terms of the B2B offering, that's what we have, flexibility, simplicity to launch and operate a B2B commerce platform. The second thing, the replenishment module that we have, or replenishment platform, is really focused at all the core might be the same, but we add a lot of features to that. When you're, like I mentioned, a supermarket chain, a buyer is a store, and a store, when they're buying, they're not buying 50 products, they're buying 5,000 products, 10,000 products. And the kind of platforms they had before having us, you can't really manage that kind of volume of data. And a store, whenever they're adding 5,000 products to the basket, and there's one product line they want to change in terms of quantity, they're changing it, and it's recalculating the entire basket. Right. So they need a dedicated basket, basically, to do that. So we are providing a lot of features that are dedicated to that space, like a specific B2B checkout, a specific order management system that makes it so that you can modify the order, whether you are the buyer or the supplier, even if it has been placed. We have a lot of potential connectivity with like the systems they're using in store. We're connected with Zebra devices, with Honeywell devices, so that the people in store can scan, and then it's immediately. Even there's the use case in which you're in a store, but you don't have the Wi-Fi. You're in the back end of your store and you have no reception, and you're like, okay, how am I going to interact with the web platform to source all my products? And so we have found lots of ways to address those kind of things. So replenishment is more in those supply chain use cases that we're addressing, with a lot of specificities, specific features to address those use cases.
Love it. Makes complete sense. And how do you guys make your money? Do you charge by module? Do you charge by number of orders through the platform, GMV? Like, what is your model, your go-to-market model, if I was to take on your platform today as a B2B seller?
Yeah, so we have a license that our customers pay for to access basically the platform. So the platform is a SaaS platform. So everything we do, we maintain, we host, we support, and we deliver constantly a new set of features. Every 2 weeks, we have a new set of features that are released for all our customers. So that's basically what customers are paying for with the license fee. And then we have a variable element. So in B2B, you have to adapt a bit to the kind of sector you're in, or if you're dealing with a manufacturer, a distributor. If we're dealing with companies where we're going to process the entirety of the turnover, it's not necessarily a high percentage on the GMV we're generating on those platforms. For other customers, it might be the case. So we adapt, but there is always a variable element to it, because of course, as we are a SaaS solution, any kind of increase in the volume that's represented by the activity of the customer, we have to reflect it in it's a reflection of the increased costs. Yeah, exactly.
Makes complete sense. Now, what's on your radar in terms of new development, any new features and functions that are coming out, say in the next 6 months or so? What's high on your radar, high on your priority list over the next 6 months to deliver to the market?
What do you think? AI?
Hey, of course, got to be AI. Everybody's talking about it. Unless you got AI in your name, I'm not sure you can get funding these days.
Yeah, that's pretty much true. The thing we are working on in the nearest future is personalized recommendation of orders. It's going to use AI, of course, to do that data analysis and kind of suggestions of order to customers. So the first area in which we're going to invest in that is the replenishment case, where we want to anticipate better what the store needs to order or is going to order, to make a suggestion to the store of all the products that they need in their shelves. But it's also something that we brought up in conversations with manufacturers, for example, that those manufacturers I was referring to, that are also interested in how they can recommend different types of assortments to specific customers. So that's the first thing we're gonna address. And then we're also ready to invest a lot more in our relationships with PSPs. We don't have a lot of B2B customers actually asking for payment capabilities, because lots of those B2B customers basically pay on invoice.
On account, yeah.
Yeah, on account.
Or something like that after the fact.
Yeah, and it's usually like coming 30, 60, 90 days after. the order, and in more general, when it comes at all. And that's that last bit, I think, that we're going to address with factoring capabilities to help our customers better manage their cash and the kind of possibility that their customer might be in default of payment.
Yes.
And that's a capability we think will bring a lot of value to a lot of our customers, especially all those B2B distributors and manufacturers.
I guess you can always form an integration with Okoro, which is in your neck of the woods, and other Balance and other B2B focused payments providers. I'm sure you can work some deals with them, and there's some pretty good solutions out there that just take a little bit of integration for them. But listen, this has been a fantastic conversation. Hours absolutely flown by. Fun conversation. I really appreciate you sharing so openly and honestly about your platform. I'll drop your LinkedIn link into the show notes. I'll drop the Just website link into the show notes. And just for everybody out there, Just is spelled DJUST, but I'll put that link into the show notes for you. Other than that, how do you like people to get a hold of you if they want to chat to you about all things B2B e-commerce?
Yeah, whatever way, I'm always happy to discuss about what we're doing. So yeah, either way.
Love it. Fantastic. Listen, now as we come down to the end of our time together, this is the chance where I get to flip the script. I get to hand the microphone over to you, let you ask me one question. Any question you like, can be personal or professional. So Mr. Alexis DELPLANQUE from Just, what is your question for me today?
Yeah. What is the next podcast you're going to host?
Next podcast I'm going to host. So I'm actually going to be a guest on a podcast later today. But the next podcast I'm going to host is a podcast I'm doing a recording of tomorrow morning from DeliverLytics, which is a delivery analytics platform. Is basically what it is for e-commerce. And so being able to run analytics, being able to run claims management, all this sort of stuff around everything to do with fulfillment in the e-commerce world. So I've actually got two recordings I'm doing tomorrow, but that's the first one tomorrow morning. So I've already got I've got about, because we release 3 episodes a week: Monday mentorship, Wednesday B2B, Friday is tech. And you guys will obviously be a B2B episode because you're a B2B focused platform. We try to record, we try to have between 6 and 8 weeks worth of episodes in advance, pre-recorded, pre-edited, ready to go, so that we can get through times like Christmas and things like that. We've got enough content queued up to get us through into the new year. So yeah, we've got about 4 or 5 more episodes we're going to record this week, and then I think we've got 6 or 7 episodes teed up to record next week. So it's a lot of fun.
Exciting.
Yes. Thank you very much. Listen, really appreciate your time. Can't wait to speak to you again soon. Are you a B2B or D2C e-commerce merchant? Then head over to greenwoodconsulting.net to learn how we can help you scale your business.